So we're talking about, remember last week we talked about why can't we see what's happening to us? And people really don't understand how formidable that is. That this is a disease, like I told you, that'll kill you 96% of the time. And 90% of the time you don't even bother to do anything about it. And that's not because you're stupid. That's the nature of the beast. So you need to understand this is no minor thing. And the hardest part is seeing it. Because once you see it, it stops working. As long as I can hide it, I can keep doing what I'm doing. And last week we talked about some of the denial mechanisms, denial, and rationalization, blaming, all that kind of stuff. And the thing that our emotional defense mechanism is as significant as I call it our psychological immune system. And it's just as significant as our physiological immunity system. And it's just important because if I don't protect myself from psychological problems I don't know how to deal with, that's a very dangerous thing. It either drive me crazy or kill me or whichever comes first. It's the same with our physiological immune system. It's there to protect us, help us survive. The problem with this is what we got to do to survive perpetuates what's killing us. So it's a catch-22. And so the hardest part is helping a person see what they're blind to. And most people, when you don't know that, you watch, you say, well, why the heck can't he see it? Because that's what's wrong. It's like asking a blind person to see. And once you understand that, then you can change your roles that can facilitate that awareness to make it harder for him not to see it. And that's not something you intuitively know how to do. In fact, enabling and making it worse is more intuitive than knowing how to deal with it. That's a normal reaction, which is what I'll be talking about next week. So anyway, let's go on. This second part is there's a lot of things in here to keep me from seeing it, but then there's things going on out here that reinforce and help blind me too. And so that's what we're going to look at today. Remember we talked about this last week, that prison he built? See, Al and Alice. And what kind of person was Al, remember? What we talked about? A really good person, high values, perfectionistic. That's why when you see some of our most talented people end up with what? Addictions a lot of time. That makes them more susceptible to the fact that they are so talented and have all that strength. And here again, some of our most talented people are people who've been through addiction and come out of it and get back to that without sabotaging themselves with addiction. And that's who they are. That gets lost. In fact, addiction is a disease of lost selfhood. That's one of the first things you lose, what you're really about. And then you start looking out here, and when you look out here, and this, let's keep going here, we'll get to it. And so Al's reality is not very good. It's not really consistent with the kind of person we've talked about, because he ends up with social problems. He embarrasses himself around friends and people. Like I said, he'll go to party and puke on the sofa or the carpet and get in fights and just go crazy. And he values social relationships. And so that's going to threaten him. And he puts up this wall to protect himself from reality. And that wall is just as real as the structural walls in this house. It's just they're not tangible. You don't see them. And what that does is it keeps him from seeing the behavior, the problem, which allows it to continue. And that means it's going to get worse. And so now he ends up with legal problems, maybe an OWI or disorderly conduct or something like that. Now, most addicts are very conservative people. They're really into law and order and respect the police and the law. And so when he violates that, that's going to be threatening to him too. So he does the same thing. He reinforces that wall. And then eventually it starts to affect the family. Now, Al values his family. He cares a lot about his family and his kids. And when you hurt somebody you care about, you hurt yourself too, and that's very threatening. So Al uses that wall to protect himself from reality. And problem is, reality is not going to go any way unless I deal with it. And so as that continues to happen, he ends up, could be medical, and that's why a lot of alcoholics die. And by the time you see it, you've missed it. That's the catch-22 also. Most people die never seeing it. And so reality starts to get around in jobs, and he comes up with reasons for that. All these things. And Al values his jobs. He's some of your best workers are people who are addicts when they get in recovery. He's a perfectionist, values doing a good job and being the best employee he can be. And when he doesn't do that, that's really threatening, and that gets that psychological immune system off and running. But reality's going to continue, and eventually it starts sneaking up on you from other areas. And so what's Al going to do when it starts coming in from other areas to survive? This isn't just something he's doing for the heck of it. This survival response. All right, we can go here. He goes back into the construction business and builds those walls. Here's the real issue now. Now he's gone from denial to delusion, because now he's hidden, he's blocked off. He doesn't know what reality is. So when you ask Al, what was that about? And you try to point that reality out to him, that denial piece comes back, hits the wall and comes back to him. That's his reality. He really doesn't know. And when you're in that situation, you can make anything okay, and that's what's really scary. But you're also self-destructing in the process. And meanwhile, you're seeing all this. The people around you are seeing all this. Okay? Here's a family. They see what's happening to him. You can see it, but he can't. And so if you see somebody you care about destroying themselves, what's a normal response to that? We talked about that a little bit. To try to help them. And that's because you care. So what you try to do is you try to protect them. And the way you do that is you start making excuses for them, buying into excuses. You drive them around so he don't get those OWIs. I can remember working with street drunks. This family, and these people sleeping on the bridge, would set up a bar in their house and said, well, we're going to give you 3 drinks a day, and trying to protect them that way. And that doesn't work, because you can't protect somebody from diabetes or cancer or heart disease or an addiction. It's a legitimate disease. The problem is, if I try to protect you and you get okay, how am I going to feel? I'm going to feel pretty good. What if I try to protect you and you don't get okay or you get worse? How am I going to feel? I'm going to feel not only like a failure, I'm going to feel responsible. And with that responsibility comes an obligation. And now I have to make you okay for me to be okay. And so then I adjust and I get into trying to control. And that's when I start doing the bars and driving you around and making excuses and buying into your excuses. That's all an attempt to try to control. And I'll talk about this again next week. There's a paradox of control. The more you try to control another person, the more that person controls you, because now their behavior determines yours. And whether they're okay or not determines whether you feel like a success or failure. And so as Al continues to get crazy, you get crazy with him. And eventually you start getting frustrated, you start blaming him for that. That's the last roll is, you're blaming him. Well, why don't he just do what I tell him? Because he can't. That'd be like saying to a blind person, why don't you just see? And you blame him, and when you blame him, that's going to trigger all his shame and guilt. So he's going to turn around and throw it back at you. Well, if you did this, and this, and that starts to trigger your psychological immune system. So you do exactly the same thing he did. You start to throw up your own walls to protect yourself from out here. And as the process gets worse, you eventually develop your own. I call it, for our side, the chemical dependency prison. From your side, I call it the addictive relationship prison. And you can't see any better than him. That's why when you walk in and that mobile's there, You don't start by dealing with the monster. You start by dealing with what's going on with me. I got to get healthy and get out of my prison before I can help you figure out what's going on with yours. And for some of us, that prison, some of it was already there before I ever met Al or Alice, you know what I'm saying? And growing up in a crazy family can reinforce some of that. And so it's a no-win. Now this side's the addict, and the other side's the co-addict. In fact, the original term for codependency was co-alcoholic or para-alcoholic. I mean, you're a mirror of each other in terms of attitudes and denial and behaviors and all. He's hooked on the booze or whatever his addiction is, and you're hooked on him. And both of you need to unhook and start getting well. And that's the hardest part to see. I call that the ism. And even if he stops the addictive behavior or the drinking, he's still got to deal with this piece, his denial and blindness, so he can see reality and do what's necessary to start to get well. And that's the hardest part. And a lot of addicts just never get to that. And so they end up either finding another addiction or self-sabotaging or something like that. By the way, going from one addiction to the other, like I told you, I call that changing seats on the Titanic. You got to help them get off the boat, but if you're on the boat with them, you need to get off the boat too. See what I'm saying? Because you can do a lot of changing seats on the Titanic in the process, and that's not helpful to anybody. All right, so let's go on and look at some of the other reasons. This is pretty important to know, the sensitivity. Addicts are more sensitive than most people. Now, they don't act like it. I like this statement. The addict sensitivity is so intense, the only way they can survive is to anesthetize themselves. And anesthetize or dissociate, depending on how they're doing it. And that's the problem, that their sensitivity, I think, is a resource, but in this situation becomes a liability. So part of recovery is learning how to make that sensitivity a resource, how to be sensitive without getting hurt. And a lot of that starts when we're kids. I'm going to be repeating myself with this when I get to these things. If you grew up in a crazy family, what did you learn about being sensitive? Was that a good thing or a bad thing? No way. So you learn to turn that off and to be hard, to be tough. And I remember asking a little kid one time who grew up in a crazy family, I said about his feelings. I said, well, why is it that you can't have these feelings of sadness and stuff that other kids have? He said, 'cause you gotta be tough. And if you're a sensitive person and you have to discount that, you know, you see that with people with PTSD come back from combat. They'll tell you the same thing. When I was in Vietnam, feelings were a liability, and being sensitive was a liability. So you had to shut that down and put it away to survive. And then when you come back, you need to open it up, but you need to know how to do it in a way. See, it ain't being sensitive that's a problem. It's not knowing how to honor your sensitivity without getting hurt. And that's part of what you need help with a lot of times. So anyway, this is a fairly profound statement. And if you understand that, then you can help the person, here again, reconcile that sensitivity and learn how to be sensitive in a way that doesn't hurt. I'm a very sensitive person, but I won't tell on you if you don't tell on me. And when you're a guy, though, you're not supposed to be that way. You got to be tough. And heck, ex-Marine and all. I've often thought about starting a support group for guys like me and call it Sissies Anonymous.
That's going to go over big.
I thought it might, but yeah. And here's the thing. I value my sensitivity. It's helped me in my life, in my world. And I couldn't, by abandoning that, I really wounded myself. And so I've had to do some work to learn how to be okay with that and have it in a way where I don't get hurt. And that's been important. And I've worked with a lot of people to help them with that. And it doesn't just have to be guys. It can be women or whatever. And my whole family, I got that sensitivity from my alcoholic grandfather, from my mom, who was on the other side with her own co-addict stuff, and then her mom was that way. So it's kind of a way of honoring something from the family that was a gift, but it sure didn't feel like it when I was in that situation. Anyway, what else we got here? And here again, there's that. This is a good. You'll like this one. This is a good example of that civil war going inside between who you are and how you act. I don't know if you remember the Ted Haggard thing, that his church members brought to tears one of his confessions of sexual immorality. That was read by the board that had fired him the day earlier. And this bottom piece is one of the best statements I've ever heard of that, piece of me, that addict piece versus my true self. There's a part of my life that is so repulsive and dark that I have been warring against it all my adult life. Here's the thing. As long as you fight it, you're going to lose. So what you need to do is stop fighting it and reconcile and make friends with it. So you take that wounded part of you and absorb it so it becomes a part of you that's healthy. And when you think about it, that addict piece is a survival part of you. And a friend of mine used to always say, someday maybe you can look back and say, thank God for my addiction, because that's what bought me time till I could get well. I don't want to keep using it because it was also destroying me. But I can also, once I see it as a resource, and in my own experience, I'm glad to know I got that if I need it. I just hope I don't have to use it again. And that's where recovery and things of that nature come in. As long as I understand how to get well, I can put it on the back burner and be like a loaded weapon. It might be good to have one. I just don't ever want to have to use it. You see what I'm saying? And this is the same kind of thing. As long as you fight it, you're going to lose. So you have to cease fire and learn how to reconcile and make peace with it. And then absorb it as a part of who you are in a way that becomes a resource instead of a liability. Okay, and this is the rest of it. Okay, he resigned as president of the National Association of Evangelicals, which represent 30 million Christians, after a man claimed to have had drug-related ties with him. But, and the first thing I would say is, let's find out if that was because he was crazy or if he had a problem. Because if he had a problem, that's different from just doing it because you're bad. And unfortunately, we don't do that as often enough. So, now this is Patrick Carnes is expert on compulsive sexual behavior. He wrote a book called Out of the Shadows, which is almost like a textbook book for sex addicts. And this is a good example of building that prison. Addicts progressively go through stages where they retreat further from the reality of friends, family, and work. Their secret life become more real than their public life. Eventually, what other people see and know is a false identity. I call it the image. Only the addict knows the shame of living a double life, the real world and the addict's world. Living a double life is distortion of reality. An essential part of sanity is being grounded in reality. One thing is certain, addiction distorts one's sense of reality. Not only distorts it, it forces you to mitigate it to survive it. And so even if you win that one, you lose. So that's a good description of that, why you don't know who you are from how you act and kind of thing. The following post appeared on Las Vegas section of Craigslist.com. Now you gotta love this guy, okay? This is addictive logic if you ever heard it, all right? I'm a 21-year-old poker player, having trouble getting work here in Las Vegas. I'm looking for someone to sponsor or back me in either live games or tournaments so I can make a living and get my rent paid, which is due in about a week. Look at this. I don't care about the stakes. Anything's good. I just love playing and need a way to make money. Let me ask you a question. Are those casinos set up to give you their money? No way. You ain't likely to make money. You'll win a few battles, but ultimately you're going to lose the war. But you see that logic? Somehow I'm different. I know what I'm doing. I'm going to make money. I'll give anyone a good cut. This guy ain't made dime one. He's already passing out the cuts, right? 70-30, or we'll split it down the middle. I'm not saying I'm going to win every time. He's not that dumb. But I will say, now listen to this logic, that I do know that I am a top-notch poker player, because if I wasn't, I don't think I would be posting this on a public site. Anybody can post it on there. You see what I'm saying? I could post that I'm an all-star football player on Craigslist, but that don't make me one. You see what I'm saying? But you see the thinking there? Anybody want to buy into that one? I don't think so. But do you think he can see what I just described? No, I think he's serious as a heart attack. You know? And that's the beast right there. Go ahead. These are the kind of things you hear from addicts. Now, this is a disease of blindness and denial. There are specific attitudes that contribute to this, in addition to this immunity thing. When he gets into his addiction, he doesn't see it as a solution. He sees it doesn't see it as a problem. He sees it as a solution. Problem is, somewhere along the way it goes from solution to problem, but he doesn't see that when it happens, because he can't afford to do that. He feels that resolving addictive behavior is just a matter of willpower. All I got to do is try hard enough. I got to share this one with you. I remember early on they say, you want to find out about willpower and addiction, eat a box of X-Lax and try to use your willpower to keep from crapping your pants. See how well that works for you. And it's amazing. When I was working with street drunks, these were guys sleeping under the bridge in abandoned cars and carrying everything they own in a paper bag. You'd think they'd be able to see it, wouldn't you? And yet when they would go out and drink, you'd say, oh, what's that? Say, oh, I just didn't try hard enough. No. Most of them didn't make it, because that's really the reasons why you have to do that. Just a problem of willpower. Like I said, addicts are perfectionistic, and they have this I don't want to be a failure attitude. And if you keep trying to control something you can't control, what's going to happen? You're going to feel like a failure. So that's going to reinforce this, so you have to deny that. The addict also has a I must be in control to be okay attitude. And so they keep trying to control something they can't control and failing. And so they have to, the only way they can survive that is to say, well, you know, I don't have control. Or the reason I couldn't control it is something else. And now they don't have to feel so bad about that. So this is a version of control. The addict gets into a rigid, all nothing, black, white, right or wrong. It's this or that. And if I do that, if I say it's either this way or that way, that rules out anything in the middle. And that gives me an illusion of control. But it also narrows my attention down to very few choices. So it ends up putting me more out of control. But that can help me. That's part of my denial too. And they really believe it. And it's really do. And then when push comes to shove, they get into this I'm a victim and nobody understands me mentality. I got to share this one with you. There's a great Dolly Parton line on that one I've used before. It just says, get off the cross, somebody needs the wood. But and that's a form of self-judgment when you get into that victim thing, you know what I'm saying? And then there's something called the law of human behavior. That means two opposites can exist in the same person at the same time. And with Al, He has to choose between reality or his addiction. And if he chooses reality, he's going to have to deal with his addiction. And if you're Al and you have all that kind of pain and conflict going on, and you have to choose between reality and addiction, which one are you going to pick? I think so. And the only way you can do that is if you deny or blind yourself to reality. You see how that works? Okay, and what else we got here? Then there's this faulty memory system. You don't always remember things. Blackouts. Gamblers have brownouts when they're in the casino for long enough. Long period of time go by, you don't remember what happened. With a blackout, there's one kind is every time you drink, every time you get drunk, you kill about 10,000 brain cells. And if the memory is housed in that part of the brain that's destroyed, you won't remember it. It's gone. And if I go out and I do something really obnoxious, and I go home and somebody comes up the next day and say, Ed, you wouldn't believe what you did last night. And they start trying to tell me, and it's totally in conflict with who I am. What am I going to do? I'm going to say, no, it wasn't me. Where'd you get that from? You know?
Say the brownout,
That's where, a lot of times, where you get that's more with dissociative addictions. The substance addictions erase the memory by destroying this brain that houses it. The brownout says, I'm so busy focusing here, I miss everything going on around me. So I don't remember any of that stuff. And it does the same thing in a different way. Then there's repression. That means last night when I was my addiction, when I was doing, I did something that's so inconsistent with who I am. The only way I could survive it is push it down in my subconscious where I can't see it. It's still there, it's just I don't remember it now. And it'll come out sometimes in flashbacks or nightmares and things like that. But here's my point. If I'm behaving in a way that's so in conflict with who I am that I have to hide it from myself, that's some pretty significant psychological self-abuse, I think. And I think that's fairly significant. It's important to help the addict understand that that ain't normal and he don't deserve to abuse himself that way. But so, then there's euphoric recall. That's our feeling memory. That means that whenever you ask an addict about what he remembers about his experience, whether it's drinking or gambling, he always remembers the good things that happened. He never remembers all the crazy, the arrests or the fights or the negative stuff. So that keeps him from seeing the reality of what's going on. So then there's a conspiracy of silence. It gets covered up. And one of the first places, there's society and our culture. Good example with drinking, we don't call alcoholics when they're drinking, getting drunk, drug users. And we don't call getting drunk, a drug problem. We call it zonked or blitzed or plastered or kind of euphemize it. And that makes it sound less significant. And our culture does that. Family and friends do the same thing. We cover it up. We're afraid to tell them what's going on, and we're not honest with them because our own addictive stuff, you see. And most professionals don't have a clue about addiction. I went to school, I went to undergraduate and graduate school, came out with a master's degree in counseling and education, and went to work for a residential facility working with street drunks, and didn't know a thing about it. Hadn't had a single class on it. I came back and taught a class for that university after I'd worked for a while and didn't know anything about it. I learned on the job wherever I could beg, borrow, and steal it. I was also a practicing addict myself at the time and didn't see it. I could see it in you, but I couldn't see it in me. And I'd go in, I'd do assessment, and I'd say, this guy's got a problem. And I'd say, well, I'm just like that. What's wrong with this picture? And that's when I decided maybe I ought to start doing some work on my own self instead of fixing everybody else. I was teaching drunk driver classes, and I'd have a few drinks and drive out and teach a drunk driver class. Does that sound normal? And didn't have a clue. So, professionals, most counselors, here again, physicians, if a doctor goes through 20 years of medical school, he's lucky if he gets 2 hours of training in addictions, chemical or substance. Unless the person goes out of their way to get the training. It's there now, but most of them, in fact, I asked my doctor one time, I said, how come you guys miss this stuff so much? How come you don't pick up on this? And he said very bluntly, he said, well, you treat what you know. And I said, good point. And they just don't know. Counselors, I was talking about them. If I go to a marriage and family counselor, because I got a wife with no sense of humor, and she just doesn't appreciate all I'm doing for her and everything, and just causing trouble. And I go in to try to get her fixed and straighten her out, and go in, and the counselor starts focusing on assertiveness issues or boundaries and things of that nature, and doesn't ask me about my drinking or what's going on with all that. What did the counselor just do? Just cover it up. He just reinforced my denial. Well, the problem's not my drinking, it's her. And it's all this stuff out here. And if I can get that squared away, I'll be okay. If, same way with job counselors. If I go to vocational counselor because I can't keep jobs, I don't know about you, but back when I was drinking, when I'd have a job and things would start going good, some craphead would show up and screw it up. And go in and he starts focusing on job skills and how to write a resume and all that kind of stuff. What did he just do? And don't talk to me about my drinking related behavior, that might have something to do with it. He just covered it up. And that's not because they don't care, they just don't know. And I think that's unfortunate. Attorneys, they're paid enablers. If I go out and I run into this cop that and they don't have anything better to do. And like I told you, a guy told me once, Eau Claire got more cops than the city of Chicago. And they're just out there waiting for you, and they know my car, and it's always the last one to leave the bar, So they don't have anything better to do, and he pulled me over and gets me for an OWI. And I go to see an attorney and say, hey, I need to do something. What's the attorney going to be concerned about? Yeah, saving my license or getting me off. And you always hear that, getting their money. Yeah, they're going to be worried about that. But primarily it's going to be, how are we going to get you off? And that's what I'm thinking. When I go in to see him, I'm not going in there because I think I might have a problem with alcohol or drugs or some other addiction. Same way if I'm a gambler and I've embezzled a lot of money and I go in to see an attorney. Same thing. And so that attorney just reinforced my denial and covered it up and helped perpetuate it.
It always goes back to the money, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. Mm-hmm. But he can get his money without enabling me and
oh, right.
I hear what you're saying. That's true. But I see that all along the way, and it's unfortunate. It's really unfortunate. Because I don't need a lot of help hiding it from myself, but I sure get it. You see what I'm saying? I sure get it. And that just makes it even harder for me to see. And plus, if it's coming from the culture or professionals and things like that, then it gives what I believe more credibility. Then I must be right. Because if I wasn't, my doctor would tell me about it, or my attorney would have said something about that, or surely my counselor would have said something about that. But that's all part of the system, part of the culture. Okay. And then there's something I call cultural contradiction. Now addictions progress. All right, let's go. Let's show you. When you first start using, it's called social or recreational use or drinking a problem. No sweat, no problems, nobody pays any attention to it. And most people stay there. But some of us got potential. And somewhere along the way, some people got more potential than others. Boy, did I ever have potential, right? Yeah. And somewhere along the way, it starts to change. This is a gradual thing. And then there start to be some problems, just little things. I miss a couple days at work, and my wife gets upset about it, and I just say, well, what the hell she know, and or I start having some problems, and at that point I'm into abuse now. And I call best definition of addiction I heard, one of the best is a behavior becomes a problem when it costs you more than money, and when you pay an emotional price for it, and that's when the denial starts. Is when that piece comes in. That's when I start protecting myself, and even there starts getting reinforced. But then I start getting some consequences, and then if I keep going, which I probably will, eventually I'll slip into addiction and start having some serious life problems. Life becomes unmanageable, and at that point, the addict is identified and behavior is treated as bad or wrong, like a criminal. Cultural contradiction, because we call addiction a disease and treat it like a crime. And that guarantees it's going to perpetuate my denial. Think about this. What if we did that with some other chronic fatal disease? Let's say diabetes. What if we criminalized diabetes and then made insulin illegal or a crime to have? Would we make that problem better or worse? And that's what we've done with addiction, and it's just, and it sets the addict up. It reinforces that inner conflict, because now whatever I do is validated. I'm treated like a criminal and a bad person. And it's, in fact, addiction can only exist where there's a conflict between my values and my behavior. I remember reading years ago that said, in our culture, where we have this cultural contradiction, anyone who can develop a problem probably will, because that's just it's set up that way. And it can be true of whatever the addiction is, whether it's drinking or substance or drug, or whether it's gambling, or whether it's compulsive sexual behavior, pornography, or that kind of stuff. Once we identify, instead of saying, maybe we ought to see what's wrong here, we automatically make the person culpable and charge them and treat them like criminals. And that makes it worse. Okay. Well, it actually goes back to the disease.
Oh, okay.
When you see him in prison, he's doing what he's got to do, and I would too, to get the hell out of there.
Okay.
When I was in the Marine Corps in Parris Island, that was like being in prison.
Yeah, okay.
And Marine Corps had something, I'm pardon my friends, called a shitbird platoon. And if you got in trouble there and you ended up in the brig, that was dead time. It didn't count toward getting out of the Marine Corps. So I did what I had to do to stay out of trouble. So I was called doing time.
All right. Yeah.
And that's okay, except it doesn't help the person, because once they get out, the drug's gone, but that ism piece is still there.
Right,
and that's the piece that you can't see that they need help with. And they don't see that either. The whole culture needs some work.
Yeah.
But prisons aren't set up for treatment. That's not their job.
Yeah.
See, we have a misnomer. You don't want to get me started on this one. We have a criminal punishment system that we euphemistically call criminal justice. And there's two different things. Justice and punishment is two different things. And punishment makes a problem worse for an addict because it reinforces all that conflict I was talking about. And we confuse culpability with accountability. So we need... internal shame. Exactly. Yeah, we need to help them get from here to here. Right. And also the system reinforces looking out here. And that's part of the problem, is that external locus of control is what it's called. And I'll talk about that more in the next couple weeks. That means, where do you live your life from? People that live their life, external means I live my life from the outside in. And what we know of people that do that is they don't do so well. They're not very successful, and they end up in prison. Then recovering people and people that are more successful have what's called an internal locus of control. That means I live my life from the inside out, from who I am as a person. And that's one of the first things that gets lost when you're an addict, is who you are as a person. And so you come out and the only thing you know is out here, so that's where you go back to. And if you don't change that system, it's going to pull you right back in.
Yeah, their denial's still the same.
No question, you haven't dealt with any. Exactly right. Yeah. If we set up our system that based on attention and not detention. In fact, there is a Franciscan priest, Richard Rohr, who uses example from Ezekiel that says instead of punishment, what these people need is unconditional love. And our system's not set up for that. It's set up for punishment, and it makes it worse. And not only addicts, I've done a lot of work in corrections. When I was in Virginia, we had called a COP program, and that stood for Correctional Outreach Program, and went into prisons and found addicts and non-addicts and did work with them to help them start to deal with some of these things. And what I saw in there with both the addicts and the non-addicts was the same denial mechanism, the same kind of thinking and mentality. And so we put them in there for 6 months or 3 years and warehouse them, and then turn them loose, and then wonder why they didn't. They're back in 2 weeks and wonder what happened. So then we blame them instead of looking at maybe we're doing something wrong. Good example is, and I might be way out here, after the second or third OWI, it ain't about the person. What's wrong with our system that we're messing it up? I was teaching OWI groups back when I first started. I had a night class at the tech school, and they would use it for multiple offenders because the state didn't have any. And they had this wonderful class called Group Dynamics. And when you got your first OWI, they were mandated to send people to it. And it was set up by the Department of Transportation, and the focus was on the driving. And if you get an OWI operating while intoxicated, what part of that got you in trouble? The while intoxicated. And if you focus on the operating, what do you miss? And it was great. And it was job security. I'm sorry. Because they would get in there and they would give you these little computer things that showed how much you weigh and how much you could drink without being over the legal limit and not get drunk. Have anybody ever seen anybody walk in a bar and whip one of those out? If you did, stay the hell away from them. They're crazy, right? And if you're like Al, ain't no way that's going to work. Because once you have one, you're off and running. And they just didn't understand that. But I tried to focus on the kind of stuff we're talking about here, helping them look at while intoxicated and what that was about. And it seemed to work better. And so that group dynamics didn't work, and it was multiple over and over and over. Then they developed a multiple offenders program, which was an advanced version of group dynamics. You still didn't get it, you know. But I understand that's not their background. Their training is on public safety, and I'm also a federally designated certification called SAP, and only the feds could come up with something like that. That stands for Substance Abuse Professional. And we deal with the federal DOT regs for people that test positive on jobs, truck drivers, airline pilots, train engineers, and people who are in what's called safety-sensitive positions to make sure that when you're out on the interstate surrounded by 6 semis, those drivers have got their heads straight. In fact, they did a survey a number of years ago in Maryland, found out that 1 out of every 3 fatal semi crashes, the driver was intoxicated. Next time you get on the interstate, think about that. And so they
yeah,
exactly.
Just stay here, don't drive.
You ain't wrong. Well, we saw one in the ditch this morning, but that was Wisconsin winter, and I think. But every time that happens, they'll test them to make sure alcohol and drugs wasn't involved, and they do random testing. That would be called, post-accident test, and they do reasonable suspicion, and if they test positive, then they get removed from the job and can only return to job after they come and have an assessment and go through and meet the recommendations of the assessor. And that person, in my case, sets up the testing for the next up to 6 years to make sure that they're staying straight. And it's not a bad plan, really, because it forced them to look at, hey, there's more going on here than just being stupid, and there's still no guarantee, but it's focused more on helping them identify and do something about the problem than just firing them. I remember back when I first started with OWI, it wasn't anything fancy. If you got a drunk driving, they automatically fine you max, they take your license for a couple of years and put you in jail for 30 or 60 days, and that was it. And what they found out was it didn't accomplish a heck of a lot. And it hurt a lot of people, because if you had a family and lost your job, now they paid the price for it. So one of my favorite speakers is an attorney from Chicago, and I always liked this. And he said, and this is a good example of what we're talking about. He said, he was recovering alcoholic. He said, when I first got into recovery, I thought the enemy was alcohol. He said, the enemy isn't alcohol. He said, the enemy is me. And the war is not between me and alcohol. The war is between me and me. And the name of the game is not do not drink alcohol. The name of the game is change. Change that me and me stuff. But that's the hardest part to deal with. And he said, plus, you do not heal this problem by going to 12-step meetings or treatment. He said they provide an environment that's conducive to recovery. And I like this analogy. He said, it's like taking a chair and setting it in a chicken coop. Sit there for 16 weeks and see if you become a chicken. This is a very complicated, difficult disease. It's one of the most complex diseases known. It affects us body, mind, emotion, and soul.
It's something you probably got to work with every day. Right?
Pretty much. It's an ongoing thing. And so having resources to help you is just vital to me. And here again, when you start working from who you are, and remember the kind of person an alcoholic is. And if he lives his life from that, my guess is he's going to do okay. But if he lives his life from what I call his addict piece, ain't no way he's going to do okay. And there's a true self peace. By the way, that's a term that Richard Rohr used in terms of your spirit and your soul and what God put in us when we were born, And so if we stay connected to that, we'll do a lot better. Then there's that addict or wounded piece. And that civil war is about which one of them's going to run my life. And when that addict piece is running my life, I don't do so good. But when that true self is, which is who you're dealing with right now, it just works a little better. But in here again, you got to go back and find that. You ever thought about the word recovery? Recovery is defined as finding something that has been lost. What do you think got lost if you're an addict? You, who I am. So that's what I need to recover. I got to be sober to do that. But then the next step is to do the work to do that. And there's some resources that can help you with that. But you got to use them and take them and work with them.